Before there was UFC, which is the biggest fighting competition in the world currently, a more refined and technical sport had dominated the arena, boxing. When people talk about it, the first country to come up is United States, maybe Cuba or Mexico, but from the 1950s to the 1980s there was another powerhouse that dominated amateur boxing, Soviet Union. There was a brief moment when Soviet fighters were shining on the world stage, but their way of moving and preparing the athletes had a huge impact in the world of sports. What made Soviet boxing different was the way they built fighters from the ground up, using knowledge pulled from biomechanics, military structure, and state ideology. Soviets approached training boxers like engineering. Starting in the 30s, the Soviet Union invested heavily in sports science. It was one of these areas that was supposed to show the strength of the state on the world stage. Boxing became one of the key disciplines. It was a symbol of the capable Soviet citizen, composed and efficient. In 1934, the USSR Federation of Boxing was formed, which was a big step to popularization and, most importantly, systematization of the sport. A major turning point came in 1952, when the Soviet Union officially joined the Olympic Games for the first time. It was a political statement more than anything else. Boxing quickly became one of the key sports where they could demonstrate ideological and physical superiority. The preparation for Olympic success reshaped training priorities, bringing even more attention to biomechanics, recovery protocols, and tactical strategy. Until the 1970s, however, professional boxing was illegal in the country. Fights were conducted under amateur rules, typically consisting of 3 rounds of 3 minutes each, which was in line with Olympic standards of the time. Each individual boxer was studied by a team of coaches, doctors, biomechanists, and psychologists. They had detailed charts analyzing punch mechanics, recovery rates, and eye tracking. They saw a body as a system to be optimized, which left the individual out of the equation. He did not matter. What was important is the efficiency of movement and competitive edge of an athlete. This gives rise to a structured, repeatable approach. Soviet boxers weren't taught by intuition, it was a scientific process. The system included extremely precise strength and conditional protocols and overall rounded development strategy. Soviet boxers were developing strength and endurance through progressive loading. They also had training sections that worked on position-specific conditioning and tactical modeling. The emphasis was always on control. It were Soviet coaches who have introduced the systems of work on such subtle elements of a fight like distance and rhythm, as well as full emotional and spatial control of the opponent, which is still used all over the world today. The emphasis was on covering all aspects of the fight. It did not only work with the strength of an individual athlete. Among the foundational figures behind this methodology was Arkady Khrenov, one of the pioneers of scientific coaching in Soviet boxing. He helped implement biomechanical analysis in day-to-day training and set the tone for coaching as an analytical, reflective process. So what was it that actually made the Soviet style of boxing distinct from the rest? The first significant difference with other systems is footwork. Movement in space was taught before punching. Fighters were drilled endlessly on lateral steps, pivot, L-shaped advances, retreat angles, etc. A Soviet boxer learned to never cross his feet, never overextend, and always recover the base. Drills included huge volume of reps of single steps. They would have an athlete do thousands of repetitions of just moving the lead foot 10 centimeters and recovering it back. The second key feature is economy of movement. Soviet boxers didn't waste motion. There was no swinging for the fences, no unnecessary slips, and minimal range of displacement. Every movement served the purpose to control the space or create an opening. Efficiency was a gold standard, and training and in the ring. That's why even smaller Soviet boxers often looked relaxed while still generating enormous power. The third crucial component was rhythm. This is a big one. Soviet coaches taught that rhythm was a weapon and they used it as such. They played with many variations that were creating advantage for their athlete, building a dimension of the fight that not many of their opponents covered back then. They would make them establish a predictable rhythm, then break it on purpose to create surprise. A common method was to use feints not just to fake punches, but to fake timing. Make the opponent expect a punch on beat 3 and land it on the half beat instead. Their approach to sparring also stood out. Instead of full power sparring wars, as were common to many other schools of boxing, Soviet fighters often sparred in controlled tempo. This meant working at 50 to 70% intensity, focusing on decision-making and clean technique rather than power. The strategy of the fight was often to stay at a distance and throw long shots, as compared, for example, with American style that uses more hooks and uppercuts, and not to engage with aggressive exchanges to avoid getting hit unnecessarily. USSR boxing was big on defense and finishing up the opponent with surgical precision. They did a lot of isolation drills like sparring only with lead hand or sparring in a 1-on-1 meter box just to learn something very specific like distance control. Many positions were structured around problem-solving scenarios. What do you do if the opponent is taller, faster, keeps circling left, changing the stance? They were trained to recognize and solve movement puzzles in real time. Behind the scenes, Soviet boxing used serious science backed by the power of the state. They tracked force generation with pressure plates, measured ice movement in reaction tests. There are Soviet manuals that include exact angles for how far a shoulder should rotate on a cross to minimize energy loss. They took every aspect of training very seriously. Breath was coached deliberately. Inhalation through the nose on recovery, short bursts of exhale on each strike to regulate rhythm and mask fatigue. This scientific approach could be applied well to someone who was ideologically possessed. A boxer in USSR was a citizen first, the perfect socialist man, who believed that this duty was to put the honor of the state before his own life. Because of this mindset, all the methodologies that were meticulously crafted in laboratories were tested on real-life people who followed every instruction wholeheartedly. This allowed for repeatable results and systematization of training, often at the expense of the health of an individual. Philosophically, the Soviet school saw boxing as a reflection of character. You weren't just a fighter, you were a cog in the machine that had to function perfectly according to the function given to you by the powers of the state. Boxers and other athletes were on the forefront of the public display, and they were expected to be a perfect citizen. All the people involved in sports in USSR were obliged not only to train but also to study. The topics were not only related to their sport, but they included psychology, literature, and, of course, political theory. They were required to write journals, to note training impressions, and reflected on mindset. This was part of a broader Soviet idea that sport wasn't just about winning, it was about shaping human beings to serve the collective. Boxing was seen as mental training just as much as physical. This system produced some of the most technically clean boxers in amateur history. Valery Papinchenko, for example, had a very clean footwork that often looked like fencing. It was smooth, fast, and always on balance. Boris Lagutin was known for his defensive control. His slipping and countering had almost surgical timing. What united them all was discipline and composure. They didn't rely on instincts alone, but had a very clear plan, elaborated for them by the collective effort of the team standing behind each boxer. When the USSR collapsed, many coaches and fighters have left the crumbling country for a better life and brought their knowledge abroad. Today, you can still trace the Soviet method in Cuban and Kazakh boxing. They use same rhythm control, same angular footwork, same emphasis on clean, efficient mechanics. Soviet-style drills show up in many boxing gyms around the world. Partner footwork grids, delayed jab release timing, or isolated lead hand sparring, which was the secret of the regime at some point, are now a known methodology of training for anyone who is serious about fighting. The legacy of the people who put their life on the pedestal of winning at any cost is still alive. The Soviet school of boxing was built on discipline, structure, and the belief that movement could be taught as a system. They have put a lot of resources into finding a perfect method to shape a human being into a desirable form. They succeeded in some aspects, but failed in others. The good side of it is that you didn't need to be born with an outstanding talent. You needed to commit to the method, and this is a reassuring message. It laid a very clear path to build yourself as a boxer and provided a process that gave athletes an understanding of many aspects of movement in space, control of the opponent, modulation of breath and emotion, and so on and so forth. This approach made something different. It produced fighters who didn't just move well, they moved with purpose.